Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? Tuesday, September 18th, 2018. You know, whenever there's a repetition of any number, I advise you to go out and buy a lottery ticket. You should not gamble, ladies and gentlemen. It's probably not worth it. But hey, it would be awesome if you won. And if you won lots of money, you could donate it through Patreon, patreon.com/KagroX, and help keep the show going. How about that? That's a good plug. Fair enough. Plus, I think you fund education in, most states in which you would buy a lottery ticket. That's usually the excuse they give for legalizing that kind of gambling. Just another example of what it takes and how it's done when it comes to bending the rules for people who really need it or want it or just need an excuse to do something fun and or not raise taxes, depending on who you are in that particular situation. Lots to discuss today. Brett Kavanaugh still with us, at least for the time being, though every indication that his nomination is on life support. But because the president is Donald Trump, it is possible that he might insist on going down to actual defeat on this thing. If that's in the cards, I don't know. But he may insist on going forward when any other president would have withdrawn the nomination quite some time ago. Or, you never know. It is possible that if Donald Trump finally concludes that it is of some disadvantage to him personally, if he finds that he's hurting because of this nomination, I suppose he could finally pull the plug. We'll discuss a little bit about what could come next, should come next, might come next for this. Right now, as it stands, we have hearings scheduled for next Monday, at which both Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey, I understand the pronunciation is Blasey Ford, will appear. I don't know if that's the optimal layout for hearings in my view, but I don't know. I don't think anybody's particularly afraid of it, though I'm sure nobody's really looking forward to it. And I don't know what hearings really are going to settle. There is always hanging out there the possibility that Republicans will simply circle the wagons and say, so what? We have the votes. If we want to force it, let's do it. But remember, there's lots of politics and optics and all sorts of things swirling around this. I guess maybe that means it would be a decent idea to start with a Twitter thread from Robert Costa, the somewhat conservative-leaning national political reporter at the Washington Post, who you all know has a relatively, conservative-leaning background. But his reporting has been pretty solid for a long time and has given us pretty good insight into what Republicans have been doing and thinking in all of this. Here is his thread, as he tells us right up front, on a few dynamics on Kavanaugh based on my conversations with several top Republicans today. 1. Are we ready for that? 1. A week is a long, long time in politics, and many people involved in the Senate and at the White House, what is this at? White House Priv. A week is a long time in politics, and many people involved in Sen and at White House. Priv C. Priv. I don't know whether that's supposed to be Priv or probably, I guess. Maybe just a typo that was auto-corrected to something that makes no sense. Privately? Maybe that's it. Privately. It's a bad abbreviation. Okay, so many people involved in the Senate and the White House privately, maybe, see next Monday's planned hearing as an eon away and still wonder if it'll happen. So there is that. And that would be interesting. If they were to withdraw the nomination before then, entirely possible, just to avoid having the spectacle. It would be really interesting for Democrats to put together a forum outside of the formal committee structure just to have Dr. Ford come and tell her story somewhere where there could be, let's say ample seating and press coverage. Just because, look, honestly, This is a story that ought to be told, and it really ultimately shouldn't matter whether or not Brett Kavanaugh's nomination still stands. If this happened, it happened. He's a prominent person. He'll still be a member, for the time being, of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and maybe he ought not to be, based on what the doctor has to say, and she ought to be able to say it. However, let's continue on with Robert Costa's thread here. So, as he mentioned, there are people involved on the Senate and White House side who see next Monday's planned hearing as a long, long time away, an eon away, and still wonder if it'll happen. And there are ongoing debates internally over whether Dr. Ford wants to go through with it, whether Judge Kavanaugh can hold on, and whether the votes in the Senate Republican Conference can hold until then. The Senate GOP can hold until then. 2, while the White House wants to drive the process, McConnell remains central to everything. Greg was reminding you of this yesterday. McConnell is the one who early on thought Judge Thapar, Thapar, I don't think I even know the name, would be the best choice, but went along with the White House. Well, you kind of have to. I mean, that's the interesting thing about the dynamics. McConnell may have had a better sense of who would pose less problems in vote wrangling, but the reality is that the president is the one who's supposed to be doing the nominating, and the Senate just has to sit there and take it. But more on that later, by the way. I don't know that Brett Kavanaugh was validly nominated, and neither do you. My same old complaint comes to light again today. We'll get to that later. So, McConnell's the one who early on thought this other judge would be the best choice, but went along with the White House. Now, as the process cracks open, he's asserting himself even as he remains a team player. Allies tell me his priority is the SCOTUS seat, not protecting Kavanaugh every news cycle. And that seems pretty obviously true. Don't underestimate the jockeying going on. This is number 3. Don't underestimate the jockeying going on in GOP circles for a post-Kavanaugh world. Advocates for Hardiman, Coney Barrett, Thapar, I wish I knew who that was, all talking with plugged-in friends in Congress or the White House, ready for the possibility of further disruption of Kavanaugh nomination between now and Monday. In other words, the rest of the shortlisters preparing themselves for the possibility that this whole thing collapses and their name comes up next. By the way, I would say I would say probably some non-zero chance out there, believe it or not, that one of the leading women candidates would not actually make it and not be nominated. And I think for possibly among the dumbest possible reasons, because again, the president is Donald Trump, and, well, lots of stupid things can happen that way. I'm speaking here of, what's her name? Amy Coney Barrett. That's who we were referring to a minute ago as Coney Barrett. You may recall, let's see, when she cropped up on the short list, there were stories about her membership and participation in a very, let's say, unusual and somewhat out of the mainstream Catholic group called, what was it? People of Praise. Yeah, and it was very much, I don't know, there was a lot about it that seemed a lot more akin to Protestant evangelical circles and charismatic circles than traditional Catholic practice, but, you know, there's a lot of Catholics in the world. What can you say? Anyway, Amy Coney Barrett is the person we were talking about here, and I was saying that there's perhaps a non-zero chance, when our friend Sponson tweeted me about this, that Trump would refuse to nominate her because he thinks her name is Comey, or at least too close to Comey. And I'm not going to nominate Comey. Are you kidding me? Comey should have been fired a long time ago, and I saved America by firing Comey. Different person, sir. It's Coney. You know, oh well, you know, people will get confused. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So we'll see about whether or not that comes to fruition. But there are plenty of names on the short list that they could go to quickly. It's just they couldn't get them. Very, very unlikely to get them confirmed before the election, which is really what it was all about. So, again, advocates for the various other candidates letting everybody know that they're ready to step in. Number 4 on Costa's list, Kavanaugh's most important ally right now is Don McGahn, the soon-to-be departing White House counsel, who has made Kav's confirmation his personal legacy project / swan song, eager to score one last victory for the conservative legal establishment, huddled with the judge most of Monday. And that's interesting, too, because, again, McGahn keeps missing the ball on sexual assault and sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, apparently, on behalf of the Trump White House, which is amazing that there'd be anyone as blind to it as Donald Trump. But apparently Don McGahn nearly batting 1,000 on these issues. So let's see. Number 5 on Costa's list, McGahn's ability to keep a tight grip on the White House side of the Kavanaugh nomination will be tested in the coming days. He still has capital with the POTUS going back to the campaign and Gorsuch, but it has been depleted over time. McGahn working closely with the Hill and legal Republicans, legal R's, to keep Senate R's together. And we'll see whether it's actually working worth a damn, I guess, in the coming days. All right, hang on a second, trying to make sure everything, all of my various media inputs are up and running and available. Make sure Twitter is available for all of you to reach us here. Let's see, number 6, several GOP consultants who work on Senate races tell me they don't want a hearing, period, at this point in the election year, in the Me Too era. Too charged, too unpredictable, they say. Expect this private grumbling to be heard more publicly as nerves over next Monday grow. Interesting that the implication earlier that Dr. Ford didn't really want this to happen either, and I have questions about that. I mean, it's almost certainly not the most comfortable thing in the world, but at this point, I do wonder whether or not she would rather have it than skip it, and that they're imputing their own feelings about the hearing to her. Or maybe that's predictive of what they think they're going to end up doing to her in the hearings. She doesn't want this because we're going to be so rough on her. You know she's not going to want this. This is going to be hardly worth it at all. That's their thinking. That's their strategy, to make sure that it's not worth it for her to come forward and make a report like this, and it's not worth it for any other women to do so in the future either. Number 7 on his list, the other concern about next Monday's scheduled hearing among top R's, the likely blizzard of questions for Kavanaugh about his teenage habits, behavior, alleged drinking during that period, etc., would be more than just a he says, she says endeavor. Under oath, unpredictable. And that does raise a number of questions, I'm sure. You have some in mind, what you would be asking Judge Kavanaugh. Has anybody heard, by the way, at any point, I haven't paid enough attention to rule it out, but has anybody seen Kavanaugh say anywhere that he has given up drinking? And he may not have, and I guess I can sort of understand why that wouldn't be part of the public record, or why he indeed might not have. I mean, it can absolutely be the case that you can have spent your young teenage years as a binge drinking alcoholic, essentially, and then simply grow up and say, I can't do that anymore, but I'll still have the occasional social drink. I wouldn't say I was quite the teenage alcoholic that this guy was. And high school, really, there was just no drinking going on as far as my crowd went, at least in high school. College, different story, but I think that's true for a lot of people. But still, I don't think it ever rose to the level that they're talking about there. There's plenty of drinking going on in college, but yeah, I mean, like daily blackout drunk drinking. No, I don't know how you survive that, but I guess some people just have hardy constitutions. Constitution. Hey, how interesting. Anyway, but certainly, having grown up and graduated and getting older and having responsibilities, and of course your body rejecting the idea of you abusing it daily to such an extent, will just naturally tend to slow a person with a capable mind and with the right non-addictive constitution, you can slow yourself down and just simply say, yeah, that just doesn't interest me anymore. But it's interesting because I also hear a lot of stories about people who drink to that level of excess, just swearing off alcohol at some point, either, through some sort of recovery program or simply going cold turkey. It didn't work out I don't know. It seems to have worked out in terms of not taking another drink, I think, for George W. Bush, although, unresolved issues. But I guess other people will deal with it differently. I just never recall hearing anywhere that he doesn't drink alcohol now. But again, I think we would have heard something about an active D.C. Circuit Court judge who was stumbling drunk around town all the time. But you never know. People like to protect one another. It's kind of a weird thing. Anyway, certainly his friend Mark Judge has been more forthcoming with his alcoholism. And I mean, two people in the same situation drinking with similar habits can come out of the same experience. One, a clinically diagnosed alcoholic, and the other not. So anything's possible. Anyway, sidebar conversation. We'll just leave it out there, though. If anybody has seen evidence of him actually addressing his drinking, though, and I guess at this point, that's one of the worries about a Monday hearing is with or without the allegations being discussed. I mean, without the allegations, this never comes up in a context like this. But the allegations having been made, you can still, if you're a Republican looking to protect him, you might avoid discussing the actual incident, but they might ask questions about, do you still drink? And you don't want that, really, in your confirmation hearing as a Supreme Court judge. Anyway, moving on with Costa's tweet storm. I guess number 8 here appears to be the last of his entries in this. So, you have an on-edge Senate GOP and a White House in defense mode. A president so far typically defensive of his pick, but also watching it all play out. I'll be at CAP on Tuesday to find out more. I'll be at the Capitol on Tuesday to find out more. Here's our latest deep dive from late Monday. That's the end of the tweet storm, and it trails off with a link to his Washington Post entry with Trump muted, White House leans on Kavanaugh to defend himself, I guess is where this will end. Yes, himself got cut off in the Twitter version of things. But, he has been atypically muted in all of this. Trump, of course, I mean, he's mouthing off about any number of other things, which he shouldn't be touching, and we can get to some of those things a little bit later. But, he's been relatively quiet on what to do about this Supreme Court seat. So, Greg shared with me a piece that I thought was particularly interesting, and I thought I would run through at least the first part of it. He sent me this piece from Politico. Let's bring this one up here. Politico magazine. What should the Senate do with Brett Kavanaugh? Now that a woman has come forward to accuse the Supreme Court nominee of sexual assault, we asked a group of legal scholars to weigh in. Now what? And it didn't come out quite right. I mean, that's the way it's printed here. We asked a group of legal scholars to weigh in, now what? They asked them to weigh in on the question of now what? Not, we asked a bunch of legal scholars, now what do we do? Well, print their answers, but you've already taken care of that. So they're pretty wise about that stuff over at Politico. When they get content, they're apt to print it. That's just what they do. All right, let's see. Check this out. I have at least one. There's a couple entries, and it's a bit of a long piece, and it could occupy an awful lot of our time. But the exciting one for me is up top. In a dramatic turn, Christine Blasey Ford, and I forget where I read, I think I put aside somewhere, there was an article that actually said, here's how you pronounce her maiden name. And do we have a new word, a new terminology for that? Her unmarried name, her previous name? What do we do? I mean, it seems like maiden name would be an antiquated term that they would like very much to get rid of. Whoever they are. I don't know. The language police. I like the language police. I stand with the language police. Right? Okay. I guess so. Anyway, just wondering. But Christine Blasey Ford, a professor at Palo Alto University, is accusing Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, did you know this, of sexually assaulting her when they were in high school in suburban Maryland. He has categorically denied the allegation. By the way, not a particularly smart way of handling this. I think there will be corroborating witnesses eventually coming forward and either testifying about this incident or others like them. Anyway, so fine. Not a particularly bright way of defending himself. There's more on that too. We'll see if we get there. He's categorically denied the allegation, and Republicans are indicating they intend to move ahead with a confirmation vote scheduled for later this week. Well, that has blown up. Democrats, along with several GOP senators, Jeff Flake of Arizona and Bob Corker of Tennessee, are calling for a pause while the Senate investigates Ford's story. Here's what our panel of legal scholars thinks should happen next. So it's not entirely clear how they put the question and how it was regarded by the various experts. What should happen next, what could happen next, what will happen next, what's most likely to happen next. We'll probably get a mixed bag of answers. The first one up, though, is like I said, the most exciting. And the pull-out quote for this one here. Oh, you know what? I see already. I'm reading the AMP version again, and I hate AMP, and you know that's the case. And just let me take a quick pause to see if I can find the original version in the original layout so that I don't make any mistakes about what parts are captions and what parts are not. Oh, by the way, interesting story about that, too. I wonder if I can remind myself. I need a producer. What I really need is a timeout button, plus a producer who I can say, write down a note about the Wikipedia thing. Now, later on, if I forget, you guys can text me using the KITM hashtag on Twitter when I say, what the hell is it I want to say? Or, when are you going to get to that Wikipedia thing? And I'll say, oh, yeah. Oh, see, I got on so many different sidetracks. You know how this goes. God help me if I'm ever president. I'm worse than Trump. All right. It is, in fact, called out as a pull-out quote right up at the top of this first section, even according to the Politico magazine version of this, not the AMP version of this. The question isn't only whether Brett Kavanaugh can still be a Supreme Court justice. It's whether he can still be a federal judge. Good question, and true, right? Remember, he's a D.C. Circuit Court judge, and he's a federal judge, period. You can be impeached as a federal judge. Can you be impeached for things you did outside of the job? Hey, you can be impeached for anything the House and Senate decide they want to impeach you for. That's the bottom line. But that's not even what she's talking about here. This is an answer from Catherine McKinnon, the James Barr Ames visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School since 2009, it says right here in parentheses, and the Elizabeth A. Long professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. And I think you should only be able to be at one law school at a time. But I guess if you're a visiting professor, it can happen. Okay. So it would be incorrect in the strictest sense to say, oh, well, she's a Harvard law professor. Well, no, she's a visiting professor of law at Harvard. She's from the University of Michigan Law School. Let's see. And there's also, I guess, contribution to this particular section from Michelle Landis Dauber, D-A-U-B-E-R, Dauber, the Frederick I. Richman professor of law at Stanford Law School. And you know you're dealing with a super fancy law school when you're not just a professor at that school. You're the Frederick I. Richmond, Frederick J. Jones III professor of law, an endowed chair. All right, that's not what this is about. This is what it's about. Judge Brett Kavanaugh is accused of behavior that, as reported, is shocking for its aggressiveness and brazenness. And I don't know. I'm inclined to skip their retelling of the story, if only because it doesn't let us get to the fun part sooner. And, it's kind of weird to be talking about the fun part when you're talking about the description of this assault. But then, again, this will give us the chance to run up to the break and make you wait past the break for the fun part. Plus, also, look, it should be recounted how serious this attack actually was, as alleged. So, he's accused of behavior that, as reported, is shocking for its aggressiveness and brazenness. The younger girl, physically forced into a room in a sneak attack by two older boys. The door locked, the music loud so no one else could hear her scream. If you haven't heard these details, this is as good a time as any. The attempt to strip her clothes off, pinned down by his body, groped, humped, which I didn't even think they were necessarily going to include in this, and I don't know who used that word first, and whether or not the editors regret allowing that one through at any point, but there it is. Groped, humped, unable to stop it from happening. The hand over her mouth, the fear of death. That was an important point in the retelling to me, that she thought he might inadvertently kill her by trying to silence her with his hand over her mouth. She may just suffocate there. Imagine that fear. The laughing male camaraderie as she was trapped, molested, terrorized. Her escape into the bathroom. And then out into the night. These are very serious allegations. And so they are. These are very serious allegations from a credible source, backed by some corroborating documentary evidence as well, in anticipation of what the victim, Professor Christine Blasey Ford, feared would be annihilation by the Trump administration. She took a lie detector test on a statement summarizing her allegations and passed. You know all that to be true. Now, as to what to do about it, wait until after the break. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Thank you very much, Scott, who sent me a note in the off period of the break to remember the Wikipedia thing. And you know what? That's only half the battle. The next challenge. Now, I remember what the Wikipedia thing is, and I'm not going to get to it yet because I have something else that I promised to deliver after the break to get to first. I remember what the Wikipedia thing is. The next issue is, and I forgot to tell you this, is someone will have to remind me, why was I interested in bringing up the Wikipedia thing? Because later on, I'm no longer in that moment. What was I talking about? I think I remember. But what were we were we still in the Costa article? Were we into this one yet? I think I got the connection in my head. I'll make one up that seems plausible enough, the one that I thought of during the break. I think this is the reason. But now you got to roll back the tape, listen to it in context, and say, you wanted to bring up the Wikipedia thing when you were talking about specifically X, Y, Z, and then I will be able to make that connection for you again later. But first, I promised to deliver on the more exciting, more interesting part of this first section, not what was alleged to have happened, as integral as that is to the story, but what could happen next. This nomination cannot continue as it was before these grave and credible allegations became known. That, it is written here, would be a slap in the face to women and survivors of sexual assault everywhere. The question isn't only whether Brett Kavanaugh can still be a Supreme Court justice, it's whether he can still be a federal judge. And I think what we were talking about was, one, that you can be impeached as a federal judge, and an impeachment is what the House and presumably later the Senate think it is. And if they decide that, you can be, you will be impeached, and they decide to convict and remove you from office, if they were wrong all along about what is or isn't an impeachable offense, once the impeachment is done, and especially if the defendant in the impeachment case is found guilty and removed from office, the deed is done. It doesn't really matter whether or not that should or shouldn't have been an impeachable offense. It has already become one. It's too late. You get to define it. And I think that we were going to talk when we get around to the impeachment thing. That's where the Wikipedia thing comes in. I hope I'm right about that. But again, back to what we wanted to see this panel of experts predict about what might come next. This was kind of an outcome I haven't really seen discussed anywhere else. Lots of discussion about whether or not it would be an impeachable offense, whether they could or should impeach him about it, whether they could or should simply see his withdrawal as enough. But this was an interesting one instead. But first, of course, the nomination just can't continue as it was before. And it's not just a question of whether he can still be a Supreme Court justice, it's whether he can still be a federal judge, period. Answering that question will not require an FBI investigation, though there are many people calling for it, or a Senate debate, though there are many people calling for that. I add, as my own commentary, it will require the court system to follow its own procedures and conduct. Its own procedures and conduct, that's true, but it will require them to follow its own procedures and conduct an impartial investigation. Do they do things like that? Well, it turns out they do. The piece continues. Such a process, remember, ended the career of Ninth Circuit Judge Alex Kozinski on the basis of information regarding the sexually salacious atmosphere in his judicial chambers. Kavanaugh, of course, clerked for Kozinski in those chambers. He just says he doesn't remember anything untoward going on, but that's the reality. He was there and says, gee whiz, I forgot all about that. Never heard anything, never saw anything. Also wasn't at that party, totally. Which party? I don't know. The one you're talking about. Under the rules of the Judicial Conference governing the behavior of federal judges, misconduct includes, quote, and it's a long quote, conduct occurring outside the performance of official duties if the conduct might have a prejudicial effect on the administration of the business of the courts, including a substantial and widespread lowering of public confidence in the courts among reasonable people, unquote. There's the reasonable person standard. Leave it to judges in writing their own judicial conference rules governing their behavior to make it that complicated. Yes, you should be held accountable for things occurring outside the performance of official duties, but only if that conduct might have, well, here we go, a prejudicial effect on the administration of the business of the courts, including a substantial and widespread lowering of public confidence in the courts among reasonable people. That is some standard. If substantiated, this allegation meets that test. Little could have worse impact on the public confidence in the courts, assuming women to be part of the public, than allowing someone who has been credibly accused of an incident Ford's therapist's notes describe as a rape attempt to decide cases. Now, the juicy part. Professor Ford need not file a complaint to initiate this investigation. Under the Judicial Conference procedures, the Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit can, quote, identify a complaint based on media reports. The matter would then be referred for a full investigation to find the facts. The conference's procedures are undergoing improvements in the way sexual harassment complaints are handled, but they are less likely to, quote, annihilate victims than the public spectacle of a politicized Senate confirmation hearing. The investigative processes take time and care to implement with fairness to all parties, making a fast confirmation impossible. And although the Judicial Conference does not have the ability to remove a sitting judge Only Congress can do that. It can conduct the investigation, make a determination of the facts, issue a reprimand, and impose sanctions. Kaczynski resigned rather than face that prospect. So what makes that so interesting and such a juicy detail? Well, one, of course, Professor Ford doesn't have to do anything in order to set this process in motion. Two, the process is serious, and although it doesn't by itself remove a sitting judge from office, it makes it all but impossible for them to continue in office, and, by the way, would serve as a pretty good starting point for the impeachment process that is the only thing that can remove a sitting judge from office. If you've been reprimanded and sanctioned by the Judicial Conference, it's a pretty clear indication that judges, your fellow judges, don't think you belong on the bench either. And if you don't have the courage and fortitude to take the hint and resign, Congress can resolve the issue for you. So what makes it so interesting? Again, if Professor Ford isn't the one who necessarily files the complaint to put this in motion, remember here that it's mentioned the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit can basically just say, look, I've been reading the papers. I see what's going on. We should initiate an investigation. It doesn't take anything more formal than that. I've seen it. You've all seen it. It's in the papers. We got to figure out what's going on here. Let's get an investigation underway. Of course, the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit. Now, this is interesting. Here's one question. I don't know if it's the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit can initiate that. Did the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit initiate it with Kaczynski, or is it the chief judge of the Ninth Circuit who would do it for Kaczynski? And because Kavanaugh sits on the D.C. Circuit, the chief of his circuit, is the one that can kick off the investigation. In any case, the point is he does sit on the D.C. Circuit, and the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals is, if you haven't looked it up yet, if you didn't see me tweet it yesterday, if you don't know off the top of your head, it's a guy by the name of Merrick Garland. So there you have it. Who can set this whole investigation in motion that may very well result in impeachment regardless of what the Senate decides to do? Merrick Garland. You should have treated him better. But he's not a petty guy, from what I understand. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, as they pointed out, Kaczynski, when this happened to him, he resigned rather than face the prospect of investigation. Whether that is a satisfactory ending to situations such as this one is a question for another day. Clearly, a new politics of sexual assault, building on the recent movement making it more visible, is urgently called for. That's the end of this first section. Now, there are a couple other suggestions here, not all of which are equally exciting. And I don't know whether we should go with those because we should fill in the blanks about other things that can happen. And I can make a note to myself about the new politics of sexual assault, because that too, obviously, in the news and the subject of many takes, some hotter than others. And another thing that Greg sent me. Why don't we just take a quick detour for that one and then come back to the other things that could possibly happen, some of which are more obvious than others. But Greg sent me the tweet of one Seth Mandel. I don't know if he says Mandel or Mandel, but Mandel, the op-ed editor of the New York Post, and according to Greg, a generally conservative-leaning guy. And so he sent me this interesting tweet and then follow-up. His first tweet, Kavanaugh's donezo. Like, it's over and done with. He's done. He's cooked. You could stick a fork in him. He's toast, etc. Why? Well, a follow-up tweet. I say this because it just morphed into a cultural reckoning of sorts, representative of something we haven't dealt with as a society, and this is going to be the moment we do so. He's done. And he appends to this the Atlantic magazine entry entitled I Believe Her, and you may have seen this one. I read it last night. Caitlin Flanagan's piece, the contributing writer at The Atlantic and author of Girlland, which sounds like she's spent more than her fair share of time having to think about these things. I believe her, and it's, of course, because when I was in high school, I faced my own Brett Kavanaugh. If you haven't read the piece, I recommend it to you, although there were a few pieces in there, a few lines in there that made me say, but I see where you're coming from, and I agree with the eventual conclusion that, yeah, this is a cultural phenomenon that needs dealing with. Seth has another comment at the end of this, by the way, saying it's not about Kavanaugh anymore, at least not wholly. We just crossed the Rubicon. We can argue over whether that's fair, but it's true. It's something different now, and there's nothing Kavanaugh can say that will make it revert to what it was before. I thought that was pretty interesting, and so did Greg, and Greg wanted to share it with you. And maybe we'll look into Caitlin Flanagan's entry on the subject a little bit later. But for now, we'll return to the other things that can happen to Kavanaugh. But again, even if we never make it all the way back to this, this is the sort of new politics of sexual assault that I think the writers of the first section, so Catherine McKinnon and, I can't remember the other name now, Dauber. We'll just flip back and see if we can get those names correct because everybody deserves it. Let's see. Yeah, Catherine McKinnon and Michelle Landis Dauber from Stanford Law School. I think they're quite correct about that new politics, and it's the sort of thing that I guess Seth Mandel and Caitlin Flanagan see coming, along with, I would estimate, millions of the rest of you as well. All right, though, other things that could happen or should happen with Kavanaugh from this point forward. The Judiciary Committee should investigate. That's a pretty traditional view of things, and I think that's the way the Senate views it at the moment. Not particularly exciting or innovative. And, to write that section, the not particularly exciting or innovative, Ilya Soman, law professor at my own alma mater, George Mason University's School of Law, and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Tells you a little bit about where he's coming from. He is the author, the articles authors feel it's important for you to know, of Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter. Again, there you have it. Super conservative? Probably. And so the result he reports here, super conservative. The woman who has accused Supreme Court nominee Judge Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault has now come forward. What should the Senate do? The Judiciary Committee should investigate the matter, potentially hold additional hearings, and if necessary, delay voting on the nomination, as recently suggested by GOP Senator Jeff Flake. Given that the alleged events in question occurred over 35 years ago, when Kavanaugh was 17 and the accuser 15, good note, getting at the truth may be very difficult or even impossible, but the committee should at least try. And this is the by far less offensive version of what the conservative mind is thinking should happen next. The truly offensive one comes at the very end. What should the standard of proof be? A Supreme Court confirmation hearing is very different from a criminal trial, where guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Denying a person a lifetime position of vast power on the nation's highest court is not the same thing as taking away his or her liberty. It is reasonable to set a lower threshold for the former than the latter. At the same time, it would be a mistake to put nominees in the position of having to definitively prove that accusations leveled against them are false. If that becomes the norm, virtually any nomination could be derailed by unsubstantiated accusations concerning alleged wrongdoing that occurred decades ago. I would thus tentatively suggest that the right standard is like that of preponderance of evidence. If the evidence indicates that it is more likely than not that a Supreme Court nominee is guilty of serious wrongdoing, that should be sufficient to reject the nomination. I think we'd be largely in agreement there, by the way. That does remind me also of a tweet that I saw yesterday from Adam Bonin, who made the very good point, I think, of reminding everybody that, if you're of the mind that, here it is, I found it. Republicans who want to believe that Democrats have a magical ability to gin up phony accusations to derail conservative Supreme Court nominees should ask themselves how Roberts, Alito, and Gorsuch saw no such allegations during their confirmation process. A good point. And he continues on to say, heck, Gorsuch was at the same prep school, in the same culture, for some of the same years as Kavanaugh. Not even a hint of any such allegations, at least not so far. And I suppose there's always time for them to come up, but that one was pretty much presented as a fait accompli, and I wouldn't be surprised if further research did find something of the sort, but it hasn't happened. And if you think Democrats are just making it up to thwart all and derail all conservative Supreme Court nominees, yeah, good point. Where were they? How come that trick wasn't in the bag for those three people? Well, maybe they're not making it up. How about that? Could that be it? No, obviously not. Could never be the case. All right, let's see. What else have we got here? We were reading about the various other things that should happen next. There is some merit, we are next told, to the idea that we should discount accusations about long ago events that occurred when the perpetrator was a minor. But whether such issues can be ignored completely depends on the seriousness of the charge and the importance of the position for which the person is being considered. Sexual assault is a serious crime, and a seat on the Supreme Court is a position of vast power. The situation may change radically if other women come forward with plausible accusations of sexual assault or harassment. Regardless, fair-minded observers should keep an open mind and should encourage the Senate to conduct as unbiased an investigation as possible. It's impossible, though. But okay. Sadly, that may be too much to expect in this era of poisonous partisan bias. Okay, so that tells us the truth about what they're going to try to do, the truth about what the standards ought to be. I'd say the truth. I mean, I think there's pretty widespread agreement in that. And the fact that, sadly, you're not going to get any of that, but that's as far as it goes. It doesn't say, well, what should we do instead, since that's a foregone conclusion. But hey, that's not what it was getting paid for. So on next to this confirmation should not proceed without a fuller account of the nominee's candor and character. Slightly different take from Deborah Rode, the Ernest W. McFarland Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. Interesting. There was the other such and such Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. This is the Ernest McFarland Professor. Totally different. I don't know. There has been so much not to like about Brett Kavanaugh, Deborah Rode writes, that it would be ironic if he is derailed by drunken behavior as a 17-year-old. But clearly, these allegations of sexual assault by a woman who has little to gain and much to lose by coming forward should give us pause, particularly in light of everything else that is problematic about his confirmation process. Recently released documents concerning Kavanaugh's work for the Bush administration leave little doubt that he made significant misrepresentations under oath during his 2004 and 2018 congressional hearings. He misstated the role that ideology played during the vetting of prior judicial nominees. He mischaracterized his role in vetting William Pryor, one of the most controversial of those nominees, and implausibly denied knowing use of stolen Judiciary Committee documents. This repeated dissembling should be disabling for any nominee, let alone one for a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. Such lack of candor, together with Kavanaugh's known statements and opinions on a range of reproductive rights and social justice issues, were more than enough reason to oppose his confirmation without reference to these recent allegations. And now we know there is much more that we don't know. Millions of pages of documents from Kavanaugh's prior Bush administration work have not been disclosed. The American public deserves better. The accuser should be given an opportunity to testify before the committee. Kavanaugh should have an opportunity to respond, and the committee should receive all relevant documents related to his previous administrative positions. This confirmation should not proceed without a fuller account of the nominee's candor and character. Next up, Lawrence Tribe, who, by the way, not just a Harvard Law School professor, but the Carl M. Loeb University professor and professor of constitutional law at Harvard. This accusation cannot responsibly be ignored. This is a short entry. This accusation of sexual assault is no longer either anonymous or uncorroborated and cannot responsibly be ignored just because of its unfortunate timing, given how much is at stake. Due process, both to Professor Ford as the alleged victim and to Judge Kavanaugh as the accused, require the confirmation process be put on hold while the truth of the matter, including the truth of the nominee's recent categorical denial under oath, is thoroughly explored. That process should include opportunities for both Professor Ford and for Judge Kavanaugh to testify publicly under oath and subject to cross-examination about these charges. It is premature to consider what weight to give to this matter until the facts are fully ventilated. And by the way, yes, as we hinted at earlier in our discussion, we have this situation where Kavanaugh is denying the whole thing. His friend Mark Judge saying the whole thing's nuts. It's just a ludicrous accusation. Him saying, Kavanaugh saying nothing. I never did anything of the sort to anybody, anywhere, at any time. And then interestingly denying to, is it Orrin Hatch? Oh, I wasn't even at that party, which is pretty amazing given that, as many people have observed, there wasn't much detail offered in the way of identifying detail offered about the party. It would be almost impossible, really, to say, oh, I wasn't at that party. Which party? She didn't say where it was or even what day it was or even exactly who was there or whose house it was at. But he's pretty sure he wasn't there, except also blackout drunk at the time. So, we're going to have to take that with a grain of salt and I guess a fifth of Jack Daniels. All right. If this claim is dismissed without inquiry into its truth, women will learn once again to keep their silence. Now, that's supposed to be presented from the more progressive viewpoint, not like, hooray, as a conservative. Hooray, let's do this so that women will once again learn to keep their silence. This is Mari, M-A-R-I, Mari Matsuda, law professor at the University of Hawaii's William S. Richardson School of Law. Sounds like a nice place to be. When serious, credible accusations of sexual assault are made against any candidate for a position of public trust, and particularly for a lifetime appointment to the federal bench, there is an obvious need to resolve this question of the candidate's fitness. To go forward without doing this undermines the integrity of the courts. More significantly, it reinforces rape culture. Dismissive responses to women's reports of assault is exactly why rape continues at epidemic levels in our country. Conservatives, of course, don't believe this. So, ask the women you know, though, and listen to them if you're not just stuck in your conservative bubble. Ask the women you know about all the times in their lives they have felt unsafe, all the times they've had to modify their behavior and constrain their own freedom. Look out, Cato Institute. Restrain their own freedom for the simple reason that sexual assault is common and rarely prosecuted. The world is watching. Our daughters are watching. What will people in power do now that these accusations are public? If the answer is nothing, how can any woman feel confident that those in charge have one whit of concern about violence against women? If this claim is dismissed without inquiry into its truth, women will learn once again to keep their silence. Men will learn once again that getting away with it is the norm. People are ready to believe that Hollywood moguls and Wall Street sharks engage in criminal conduct toward women, but lawyers, the profession of rule followers, yes, lawyers. They may well consume the same porn, summer at the same shore, come up through the same corridors of privilege as your garden variety casting couch villain. I have heard many first-hand accounts over the years from students and professional peers of harassment, assault, and rape by men in suits who sign off with Esquire. I've met them. They come in all shapes, sizes, and races. They can be charming, funny, outwardly compassionate. They practice assault and misogyny without considering themselves bad people, since they have swum in it all their lives. At the prep schools and Ivy League insider clubs where drunk fests and treating women like objects are twinned pastimes. Ask the deans at Harvard why they finally moved against those finals clubs. When Anita Hill's accusations against Clarence Thomas hit the news, the men in charge were prepared to ignore them. Back then, we had no internet, no email. Well, there was email, but not widespread use of email. But women grabbed their phones and their clunky word processors and banged out op-eds. We raised a ruckus and forced a hearing on the accusations. I did my own research and heard enough then to know that Thomas was both a harasser and a perjurer. Much of what women in Washington knew then, the public does not. The hearings were rushed, and there were many stories that never came forward. As a result, we have one known liar sitting on the highest court of the land, making decisions that shape the future for our children and grandchildren. Is the Senate about to make it too? In 2018, women have many more tools at their disposal to spread the word and fight back. I stand with my sisters of all political persuasions who believe sexual assault disqualifies one for public office. Becoming a judge is an honor and a privilege. Talk of unfairness to the candidate is ridiculous. No one is owed this job. It is the American people who are owed the truth. Nominees are supposed to undergo scrutiny before appointment. According to the codes of judicial responsibility, judges are required to avoid the tiniest whiff of the appearance of impropriety. We have more than a whiff here. We need to find out what more there is to know. Will corroborating witnesses come forward? In the Thomas case, they did. This is a lifetime appointment. We'll never know because we won't investigate is not a responsible stance. We deserve full public hearings on this issue. And, again, not one that has any particular suggestions about what to do next in terms of process or what relief may be available here, but one that I thought stated important points in persuasive ways and also gave us a chance to bring up other bits and pieces of the story. There was one passage in here that made me just prick up my ears and think about this. And which one it was, I'm not entirely sure, but I'll just blurt out the factoid that I found out, and I'll tell you a little story maybe after the break about how I found it. Brett Kavanaugh, at the time of this alleged incident, Brett Kavanaugh's mother was working as Montgomery County, Maryland assistant state's attorney. In other words, the county prosecutor for the county in which they live, Montgomery County, Maryland. The prosecutor's office was where she was working. And so just throw that in there, right? The questions of, why didn't you report this to the police? Why didn't you file charges? Why didn't you try to get Brett Kavanaugh prosecuted at the time? Well, his mom was the county prosecutor, so maybe that was a little difficult. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And, yes, by the way, I am reminded, and I do think that this is, I should straighten this out. First of all, Brett Kavanaugh's mom, we're not blaming her for any of this, and there's no allegation so far that she had anything to do with steering this case away from the judicial system. I'm simply pointing out that, one, you might maybe hope for better behavior out of the son of a county prosecutor, but, not always. But again, a lot of this, thinking about the pushback on the whole story and how it broke over the last couple of days and why didn't she report it at the time and yada, yada. It seems to me like, that might have something to do with it if you take into account that I don't know whether he said anything. I don't know that this was known among the other kids in high school at the time. But, just envisioning the scenario, it might very well be something that Kavanaugh had talked about in the past. Hey, don't worry about it. Let's do this thing, which would otherwise be illegal. My mom works in the prosecutor's office. So I should point out, she wasn't the Montgomery County state's attorney. She was an assistant state's attorney in the office, which means she'd be one of the rank and file prosecutors there. But certainly it couldn't hurt if it looked like you might come up on charges, juvenile or otherwise, to have an insider, let's say, help steer you away from the juvenile justice system, or at least the worst parts of it. But yeah, like for instance, the idea of, why didn't you report it? Or how do we know this even happened? Maybe you're making it up. And just sort of seemed to me like too picture perfect. I'm almost like a one of those after school specials. What are you kidding? The football player at the local elite prep school and his other football player buddy attacked younger girls from the Crosstown Private Girls Academy, and she was too afraid to report it. And P.S., the football player's mom works in the county prosecutor's office. Get out of here. Why, you'd be laughed out of Hollywood with a script like that, right? I think we said this yesterday. I mean, has anybody not heard this story? I mean, that's basically why I think there were the 200 women who had graduated from Dr. Ford's alma mater high school, and I keep forgetting the name of the exclusive. It's equally exclusive, right? Girls' school in Bethesda that she attended. By the way, as it turns out, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, as of Seinfeld and Veep fame, an alumnus of this I forget my Latin, but a graduate, let's say, of the same school, and basically, said as much like, yeah, that's a familiar story, and you don't have to do too much convincing. It's a story of every, I don't know, like bad after school special, or teen movie, or God knows what else. I mean, this is a familiar story. Everybody's heard this story. It doesn't take a great deal of imagination, either, I guess, to make it up or to convince other people that, hey, there's probably a significant measure of truth in this story. It sounds like it rings true, actually. But anyway, I just wanted to be clear, she wasn't the county prosecutor. And by the way, the story about how I came across that was there was a brief explosion in the right-wing blogosphere yesterday of stories that involving Kavanaugh's mother that sought to cast doubt on Ford's story. She, in addition to working in the county prosecutor's office, later went on to a judgeship in the county, Montgomery County, Maryland, and at some point presided over a portion, at least, as it turns out, of a case involving Ford's parents, the Blases, in which there were foreclosure proceedings on their home. And the right-wing blogs took this and ran with it. And I mean, by the way, others went far, far beyond this story. I mean, QAnon actually caught on to the story, or the idea that there might be some familial background here, and that the Blases had it in for the Kavanaughs for a long time, or vice versa, and that there was some intergenerational revenge story going on here. But Eric Erickson, among others, and the people at Powerline and various other wingnut blogs were reporting breathlessly that Kavanaugh's mother presided over, the way they put it, a foreclosure case against the Blases and ruled against them. And as a result, they lost Dr. Ford's childhood home to foreclosure. And as an intergenerational act of revenge, she was taking it all out on Brett Kavanaugh and trying to derail his nomination because of what his mother did in the mid-90s in a foreclosure case against them. And then, of course, Snopes got a hold of this one, and long story short, it's not true. She presided apparently over a part of this case. The outcome of the case, however, was no, the Blases didn't lose their home. They still have it and still own it, and nothing happened, and essentially. And also, the ruling that she did issue in this part of the case was apparently not unfavorable to the Blases in their case. But never mind that. Eric Erickson took great glee in pointing out that a growing body of right-wing blogs were finding out about this story and shouldn't be looked into. So by Monday, if they actually go ahead with this extra hearing, I imagine some idiot Republican will bring this already debunked story to, put it on the record, and then, I guess somebody can just read the Snopes entry and set the record straight. But now I need to make a note for myself that we got to get that Snopes entry and hand that over to Scott for the summary later on. All right. Woo. We'll continue on with, let's see, where are we? What should happen sort of thing that we're compiling. Let's see, how long until we get to the truly offensive one? Is it the last one down there? 1, 2, 3. I don't know. There's a bunch more, but not all of them are quite as long as the rest. This one here, Let the Political Chips Fall Where They May, is from Ilya Shapiro, Senior Fellow in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. Oh boy. The only thing to do at this point is let the full Senate vote, with each senator considering this late-breaking allegation however he or she chooses. Oh, that's not the only thing to do, but it's an interesting idea. Nothing can be gleaned from further investigation. A he said, she said from the mists of time isn't prone to resolution, and Judge Kavanaugh has passed half a dozen FBI background checks anyway. There's an amazing trust in the FBI from the Cato Institute here. It's certainly fishy that something like this comes out at the 11th hour, more than 3 months after Kavanaugh was nominated, more than 15 years since he was nominated to the D.C. Circuit, and after a full slate of hearings, open and closed door, and senatorial meetings. Even if the claim is true, how do we weigh it against the exemplary life the nominee has led as an adult? These are all things for senators to consider when they vote. Of course, all this takes place amid a broken public discourse and poisoned politics with attempts to impugn Judge Kavanaugh for liking baseball too much, or the horror of having been in a fraternity in college. And please, I'm not going to tell you the nickname of the secret drinking society that he belonged to, but it'll tell you a little bit more than you wanted to know about him if you ever find out what they call it. Anyway, let's see, not to mention the rolling filibuster and orchestrated protest that punctuated the confirmation hearings, which were really the first Democratic primary debate of the 2020 presidential campaign. Wow, this is garbage. Any Republican nominee is now subject to character assassination, ooh, boo-hoo, because of the apocalyptic narrative Democrats bring to Supreme Court fights and for being picked by Donald Trump, whose election the left has never accepted, and whose authority to make picks has been further questioned after the indictments and criminal pleas of several associates. Oh no. Well, you're going to have to live with that one. Sorry. Indeed, Justice Neil Gorsuch continues to be seen as illegitimate by many progressives because he, quote, stole, he did, Merrick Garland's seat, though of course Garland was never attacked personally. The only way to end this circus is to vote on Kavanaugh and let the political chips fall where they may. No, that's not true, and it's not even a particularly interesting suggestion. The Senate must slow down is the next suggestion. Abby Gluck, professor of law and faculty director of the Solomon Center for Health Law and Policy at, that's so fancy sounding it must be, Yale Law School. As we assess the latest allegations, we must insist that the Supreme Court stand for something outside of politics. Otherwise, we should just elect our judges. Above all, we must stand for the rule of law. This means we should expect a court on which judges abide by precedent, and so do not always vote their political leanings and personal biases. That's why it's wrong for anyone who believes in the role that law plays in our society to insist that a candidate is unacceptable merely because he or she does not mirror his or her own ideological positions. But the rule of law also demands due process. The Republican Party started us down this destructive path with its illegal blocking of Merrick Garland's nomination. I don't know what's illegal about it. It's mean. Didn't like it. But okay, Democrats should have protested as loudly then as they have now, but it's better late than never. Even before the recent allegations surfaced, the Senate's rushed and non-transparent process, a process that alarmingly reflects the broader deterioration of the Senate as an institution, should have been slowed down. It was a slap in the face to those, including me, who knew Judge Kavanaugh personally and were trying to keep an open mind about the merits of his confirmation after a full review of the record. The Senate has put no one at ease about confirmation or the future of the court. The very serious allegations of this weekend raise the stakes even further and require thorough and transparent review. If Kavanaugh, or anyone else, is ultimately to be confirmed, it should be based on a process that reflects on and enhances the legitimacy of the institution on which the justice will sit. The Senate must slow down and not hold a vote until the entire record can be examined, and that includes both the unreleased papers as well as a full airing of the matters associated with the personal allegations against Kavanaugh. A better and more sympathetic take for me, but again, not one that actually has any mechanical suggestions about what could, should, whatever, come next. Yes, there should be transparency, but no, they don't have to give it to you. And given their druthers, they would not. There are enough votes, or there were enough votes before these allegations. I like the high-mindedness of trying to put the allegations aside and make a broader point about transparency, but that point is lost. It's gone. There's no bringing it back. We can protest it, we can note it for the record, but yeah, as far as like what should happen next, this other part should have happened a long time ago. And guess what? It didn't. And guess what? It can't unless you have a story, a bombshell like this one. This is the only thing capable of slowing people down in this. And that's only because they're politically embarrassed. Ironic, given how she wants to depoliticize I don't know who it is, actually. Was it Abby Gluck? ABBE, that could be, I don't know, that may be Mr. Abby Gluck. I have no idea. I was thinking the name sounds like ABBY, but I don't know that that's the case. Well, I don't know. You'll tell me. But in either case, that doesn't matter, thankfully. The politicization of the court, pretty much a done deal at this point. It's a nice thought to depoliticize it, but not much in the way of practical suggestions. Not like the first entry. All right. I think we're down to the last 2 or 3 here. Oh, boy. They're still pretty lengthy, some of them. Are we getting anything out of these? I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of good points being made and a lot of fine points, a lot of nuance being brought to bear, though. We'll see. The Senate must engage in due diligence. Sanford Levinson, professor of law at the University of Texas Law School, professor of government at the University of Texas, Austin, must engage in due diligence. Okay, why? How? Now that the accusation is no longer anonymous and Kavanaugh is denying it categorically rather than, for example, citing it as a regrettable but unrepresentative incident from a previous lifetime, the Senate has a regrettable duty to engage in due diligence. I'm frankly uncertain what my response would be if Kavanaugh had immediately owned up to the accusation and noted by stipulation accurately that it was a one-time event that he genuinely regrets in every conceivable way. Perhaps it's because I'm male and of a certain age that I'd be willing to imagine letting it go, as it were. Maybe, although again, Caitlin Flanagan's piece suggests that that's not necessarily the case. Those who disagree, for better or for worse, by the way, those who disagree may well be correct that the statute of limitations never runs on sexual assault. For better or worse, I don't get to vote on this. But if he's lying by suggesting there's no truth at all to the accusations, including the accuser's against interest admission that she, like everyone else, was drunk in what was likely a highly sexualized context, where it would not be at all surprising if a guy tried to see how far he could get with someone perceived as potentially compliant girl. Danger. We're talking about well-off teenagers, after all. Then that should, in fact, be disqualifying, and one would hope that Republican senators besides Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, including perhaps the moralistic Ben Sasse, would slow down the McConnell-Grassley juggernaut. As we've learned since Watergate, the cover-up is often worse than the crime, and at least as illuminating about the character of the person engaging in the cover-up. See Bill Clinton and his lies about Monica Lewinsky, just for a backhanded slap at the end of that one. Next up, the process is completely broken. John Culhane, distinguished professor of law at Delaware Law School, where he teaches courses in constitutional and family law, says, now we have a name. Behind the allegations of sexual assault levied against Brett Kavanaugh, Christine Blasey Ford. These confirmation hearings have been a maelstrom from the beginning, and in a sad way, this revelation could end up being just another item being thrown into the vortex. The entire nomination and confirmation process for Supreme Court justices is completely broken. Even if the Judiciary Committee is forced to delay the hearings for a minute because of retiring GOP Senator Jeff Flake's call to hear Ford's story, the likeliest result is still confirmation. Even in this Me Too moment, women's stories aren't consistently heard. The president is credibly accused of sexual misconduct, but nothing happens. So it seems will be the case here. And the message sent is clear. If you've been the victim of sexual assault, don't come forward. President Trump's accusers have been ignored by a compliant Congress, and in the context of the Supreme Court, it seems we've made no progress since the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill debacle more than 25 years ago. Hill's conduct and rectitude have offered a decades-long silent reproach to the senators who responded to her courageous testimony by vilifying and downplaying her credible accusations, and my guess is that things will go the same way now. Flake's position, for which he deserves some credit, will likely allow her to be listened to but not heard. Senators on both sides will grandstand, except perhaps for Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, and no one's mind will likely be changed. I wonder why she gets accepted. Okay, fine. I guess that's good news. The debacle can be traced back to Trump's insistence on nominating Kavanaugh despite warnings that he would be a difficult candidate to push through on an expedited basis. The rush to judgment has led to all kinds of norm-shattering, see-no-evil process in the Judiciary Committee as the great majority of potentially relevant documents remain hidden from public view. There's already plenty of evidence of Kavanaugh's dishonesty based on the few, presumably safer, documents that have managed to crawl into the sunlight, but the rush to seat Kavanaugh before the Supreme Court begins its fall term next month has led the GOP majority to stand behind its unprecedented decision to push forward without the benefit of vital information, which, based on what we already know, seems quite likely to be damaging and perhaps disqualifying. So I expect the freight train to keep on course, even if the vote is delayed for a few minutes. If the GOP wants some credibility on this issue, it should appoint a neutral fact finder to investigate Ford's claim. Unlikely to happen. The FBI's function is different, and Trump has managed to politicize the Bureau to the point that whatever conclusions it might reach would not be accepted by one side. Then the Senate can decide what to do with whatever the fact finder discovers. But that's entirely too rational a process to commend itself to our broken Senate. And then finally, this awful, execrable final entry, a perfect sandbag. Richard A. Epstein is the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of Law, the New York University School of Law, Senior Fellow, the Hoover Institution, and the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Law Emeritus, the University of Chicago Law School. Author of some of my school books, by the way. The Democratic resistance, I don't even know if I can even get through this. The Democratic resistance to the Kavanaugh nomination has been an all-out assault on his judicial philosophy and personal integrity from the moment that it was announced. I have no doubt that any senator has the full and complete right to vote whatever way he or she thinks fit on the nomination, and I have no doubt that if the Democrats held a majority of the seats in the Senate, they could have stonewalled this nomination just as the Republicans did with Merrick Garland. It is well-established constitutional law that the Senate need not call a hearing, let alone schedule a vote. In retrospect, the decision not to hold any hearings on Garland, why is he talking so much about Garland, should be regarded as a wise and humane political decision because it spared Garland and the nation a similar disgraceful exhibition of intolerance that some conservative opponents of Garland may well have launched to tarnish his confirmation chances. But this last-ditch effort, this decision to sabotage Kavanaugh at the 11th hour is a disgusting piece of political propaganda. Christine Blasey Ford behaved wholly improperly when she decided to write a letter only to a senior Democratic lawmaker in which she made the most serious allegations of sexual assault against Kavanaugh. At the very least, she ought to have handled matters wholly differently. If she wanted to keep matters confidential, she should have sent that letter to President Trump and to Senator Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Well, that would have kept it confidential, all right. But, by the way, President Trump, biggest leaker in history. What a dumb suggestion that is. She also should have sent it to the FBI for investigation, and she should have done all these things at the earliest possible moment, in time for a principled and neutral examination to take place before the Senate hearings took place. Then she should have sat for cross-examination. None of which would have happened, by the way. I would never have called her. They would have said, okay, thank you, put it in the trash bin. That's the dumbest suggestion I've seen yet from a supposedly distinguished lawyer. That's just borderline idiotic. Putting the information exclusively in the hands of key Democrats thus invited the wholly corrupt strategy that is now unfolded. And by the way, putting it exclusively in the hands of key Republicans would have invited a different corrupt strategy. That's dumb. Come on, Epstein, wake up. First, the Democrats would try to discredit Kavanaugh by engaging in a set of procedural antics and obnoxious substantive questions. Oh, no, not those obnoxious substantive questions during the hearing without mentioning this letter. When that strategy abjectly failed, they knew they had to go to Plan B, which was to release the letter and the allegation days before the confirmation vote. A perfect sandbag. For the Democrats knew full well, as did Republicans, by the way, that there was no time to respond to them without causing an enormous delay in the confirmation hearings. Oh, no. Their hope was and is to create a huge media circus that would take weeks, if not months, to sort out, shipwreck this nomination, make it impossible for the current Senate to pass on any subsequent nominee before January, then take control of the Senate and create a stalemate that could run on until the next presidential election. And by the way, I'm for that. And for what? Ford, Kavanaugh's accuser, maintained a stony silence on these allegations for more than 35 years. Is this disgusting or what? At no point did she raise them in connection with the Senate confirmation hearings before Kavanaugh was confirmed in 2006. Kavanaugh has categorically denied the allegations. Late last week, Mark Judge, his alleged accomplice, denounced the allegation as absolutely nuts. No other woman has ever made any allegation of this sort against Kavanaugh. Watch the clock for a little bit and find out whether that stays true. And 65 women have written an explicit letter in his defense. And of course, we're now down to apparently 2 who will stand by that defense. Kavanaugh is right not to respond beyond his categorical denial. He is not. Knowing full well that further comment would only draw him further into a vortex on which credibility determinations would be unending, and the Senate is right to continue with the confirmation vote. The institutional damage to the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the nation has already been enormous. What is left now is only the sorry task of damage containment, about which he suggests nothing. What sane judge would like to be the next Supreme Court nominee? Well, that's a question I actually asked back in June, when it was pretty obvious then that the next nominee would be raked over the coals. Why didn't they pick somebody with like a more distinguished career or less known trouble? I don't know, but apparently neither the Senate, the president wouldn't do it, couldn't be convinced of it, and neither could the Senate convince him of it. And that's the end of our, the theme, what should the Senate do with Brett Kavanaugh? I guess we sort of deviated from that in a number of ways, but I don't know. I mean, okay. For balance, we presented all of those different viewpoints. Not all of them, I think, are valid in any way whatsoever, but a lot of good points raised, especially in that first one, a rather exciting prospect that it could be up to Merrick Garland to kick off an independent investigation in the judiciary of Kavanaugh's behavior that could then find its way to the Judiciary Committee later on in the House with a stamp on it. Impeachment, question mark? Just throwing that out there. Maybe you want to consider this. All right, let's see. Where to go with the rest of the show? Well, first of all, I guess we could now remember our Wikipedia thing. And as I recall, the reason that I had brought that up, let me see if I can find that Wikipedia entry just for fun and bring it up for you here. Let's see. It was, yes. Okay. And we'll put that in there. The connection, as I recall, from the earlier in the show was we were talking about the question of whether or not Kavanaugh could be impeached from his current position on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals over these allegations or any other allegations. I mean, last week, maybe the week before, we were talking about the possibility of impeaching him from his circuit court position once confirmed to the Supreme Court. Once, again, we want to point out, you don't have to still be serving in that position in order to be impeached from it. There is historical precedent for impeaching an official who has since left the position even before the impeachment proceedings began. So at least we have that on the books. Not that anybody necessarily wants to go back there, but that's true. It's just, it happened. It's on the books, and that's the way it is. But one, we had, of course, the observation that, well, you know, you can impeach them for anything, I suppose. If you can convince a majority of the House that you want to impeach, then whatever the hell the infraction is alleged to be is an impeachable offense. It just happens. Whether or not the Senate thinks it measures up to something that they would want to remove that person from office for, even if we had a fair vote where people were really voting on the issue itself rather than regarding it as a partisan test of some kind. But at any rate, again, impeachment is, like Jerry Ford is alleged to have said, whatever the House says it is. So, what sorts of other things did that bring to mind? Well, it was raised as an issue a couple of days ago. And I guess we'll have to continue on the other side of this break. But I saw, and I think I put it aside here, and I don't know whether we shared it or not, but Charlie Savage had put out a piece, and let's see, do I have it in here somewhere? But basically saying, in discussing the Mueller investigation. Do you remember the Mueller investigation? That's ongoing. They're investigating the president, possible collusion, all that sort of stuff, money laundering, various other crimes. The question was raised, what would happen to his report? What would he do at the end? What would Mueller do at the end? Just as we were wondering what could happen to Kavanaugh next. Lots of possibilities. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, continuing from what we teased with at the beginning, just before the break. So I was mulling over what was going on in the Mueller investigation. This gives us a chance to switch tacks for just a moment. This is the Charlie Savage piece from the end of last week, Friday, the 14th. Legal experts urge release of Watergate report to offer Mueller a roadmap. And this was sort of a interesting procedural observation, which, by the way, although I'm going to spend probably the rest of the show on procedure, another thing that Greg sent me that was of some interest, just I guess maybe be our last entry on the Kavanaugh thing, was this number that he tweeted the other day. If you're making process arguments, Barrow tweets, you're losing. People do say that all the time, although really, you have to be talking about process. It's important. But if you are making process arguments, people who are into optics, say you're losing. For the first time in the Kavanaugh process, Republicans are making process arguments. Feinstein should have told us earlier. Maybe, he says, but who cares? A good point there. But back to our process argument, because we're losers. Legal experts urge release of Watergate report to offer Mueller a roadmap. Check out the way this sets up by Charlie Savage. A question has loomed over Washington. What will the special counsel, Robert S. Mueller III, in case you didn't know, do when he wraps up his investigation into whether the Trump campaign conspired with Russia and whether President Trump obstructed justice? The leading theory is that Mr. Mueller will write a report for his supervisor at the Justice Department. That's the by-the-book way, and people say, generally speaking, Mueller's a by-the-book guy. So write a report for his supervisor at the Justice Department. That could lead to a new fight. Mr. Trump's lawyer, sort of, Rudolph W. Giuliani, in fact, has suggested that the White House may then invoke executive privilege and order the Justice Department to keep portions of such a report confidential from Congress. It's an interesting play. And you've likely heard the news, but, could they do that? And remember, of course, how this is going to go. His boss at the Justice Department nominally would have been usually the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, but he recused himself. That's how we got Rod Rosenstein instead. So the leading theory is Mueller will write a report, send it to Rosenstein at the Justice Department. At that point, Giuliani claims Trump would say, I am invoking executive privilege, and this report can't go any further, or at least portions of it can't go any further than the Justice Department. You can't send it to Congress, who might otherwise seek to investigate, particularly if it's under Democratic control at that point, might seek to investigate whether or not those allegations are credible and ought to lead to impeachment or some other outcome. So, what are we going to do? If they invoke executive privilege, we could fight that out. They might lose. They may have no basis for invoking executive privilege. There could be a crime fraud exception to the executive privilege claim. We don't know. But there is one way, it's suggested, of short-circuiting that fight. There is historical precedent for another model. echoing a move by the Watergate prosecutor in March 1974, the grand jury with which Mr. Mueller has been working could try to send a report about the evidence it gathered directly to the House Judiciary Committee. And on Friday, seeking to draw more attention to that option, 3 prominent legal analysts asked the court to lift the veil of secrecy that has long kept that Watergate-era report hidden. Now, we're going into a different area of process here than was actually relevant to the point that I was reminded of when we were discussing things earlier, but this is equally important. Specifically, the petition asks the judge to unseal a report that Leon Jaworski, the Watergate prosecutor, used to send Congress the evidence he had gathered about President Richard M. Nixon's misconduct. Known as the Roadmap, it was a 55-page index describing evidence and citing underlying testimony and tapes, but without any legal analysis or recommendations about whether Mr. Nixon committed an impeachable offense. While the Judiciary Committee had access to the roadmap, it has remained sealed from public view. This petition represents an extraordinarily compelling interest in disclosure arrayed against a vanishingly small countervailing interest, the court filing said, noting that the Watergate players are mostly dead and that much of the evidence is already public. It added, not only does the roadmap carry immense historical significance in understanding the Watergate investigation, it provides a key precedent for assessing the appropriate framework for Special Counsel Mueller to report to Congress any findings of potentially unlawful conduct by President Trump. So we'll pause here for a second to say, to question, if someone like Trump and Giuliani can come up with the strategy of invoking executive privilege to block the report to the Justice Department from making it to the Congress and possibly leading to impeachment proceedings, how is it that the legal team behind Richard Nixon didn't think of such a thing? And the answer may be, the answer first may be that Jaworski laid out this possibility of the grand jury making its report directly to them. And I don't know whether, is it, as I'm thinking about this, did the grand jury actually do that, or did they simply say it was possible to do that, to exercise that option? And, because the Nixon group was perhaps keener legal minds, essentially, I would guess that the floating of the possibility of the grand jury reporting directly to the House Judiciary Committee is meant for somebody who's competent to obviate the efficacy. Do I match my words here correctly? To make it, in other words, to remove the point of even trying to test the assertion of executive privilege. Because I'm sure that it happened that Nixon's people said, well, why don't we think about invoking executive privilege to block this report from getting to, we'll block the evidence from getting to the House Judiciary Committee. Now, of course, he was dealing with a Democratic Congress, so I'm not entirely certain that they would have stood for that. They may have been able to subpoena that information and pry it loose that way. But in all likelihood, the analysts inside the White House said, well, for one thing, the Congress can subpoena it. For another, the grand jury can send that report directly. So we could invoke executive privilege, but it wouldn't help us any because it would never be in our hands to invoke privilege over. There are at least 2 ways that they can bypass our claim of privilege. And so you might as well not cause the problems. You might as well not create the constitutional crisis. You might as well not lose in court because the whole thing will be mooted before they settle the issue of executive privilege anyway. Trump would say, I don't understand any of that. Executive privilege it. And therefore, you end up with this likely outcome instead. So, all right. So many things are going on here, including the very interesting idea that the roadmap, one, exists, and that it was, what an interesting method of presenting the evidence. The most unprejudiced possible version. Look, these are the things that we found, and you can find them here. Literally a roadmap to what tape should you listen to at what point, and what page should you read if you want to find out about what Nixon did about X. And that's it. A very interesting approach. Anyway, secondly, very interesting that was sealed and remains sealed, and that they make a very good argument here. At the time, there was probably a compelling argument to keep it sealed, but X number of years later, with most of the players dead and us facing another equally frightening constitutional crisis, the argument for keeping it sealed is, well, as they say, vanishingly small. So, who came up with this idea? The petition was filed by Benjamin Wittes, a Brookings Institution senior fellow and editor-in-chief of Lawfare. Boom, by the way. Hasn't really been stellar on Kavanaugh, and it'll be interesting to hear from him again. Editor-in-chief of Lawfare, an online publication that specializes in national security legal policy issues. We read it a lot. Jack Goldsmith, Harvard Law School professor and senior Justice Department official in the George W. Bush administration, and Stephen Bates, University of Nevada, Las Vegas law professor who, as a federal prosecutor working for Ken Starr, you know who he is, co-wrote the report to Congress recommending that Mr. Clinton be impeached. The three, that's an unlikely pairing to be doing this, you would think, are represented by Protect Democracy, a government watchdog group. It is uncertain how a roadmap-style grand jury report would play out in the Trump-Russia case. Justice Department rules permit Mr. Mueller's supervisor to veto any unwarranted investigative or prosecutorial step, but it is not clear whether asking a grand jury to send a report to Congress qualifies as such. Mr. Mueller's supervisor is currently Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, but that could change if Mr. Trump fires him or Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, who is recused from the Russia investigation, leaving Mr. Rosenstein as the acting Attorney General for the matter. The option of a grand jury report could also have implications if Mr. Trump were to force the Justice Department to shut down Mr. Mueller's investigation. It is not clear what would happen if the grand jury members, on their own initiative, were to ask the judge presiding over their panel to transmit to Congress all the evidence they had gathered without the executive branch's request or approval. Unlike Mr. Jaworski in 1974 and Mr. Mueller today, Mr. Starr was operating under a law enacted after Watergate and since lapsed that clearly gave him the authority to send a report directly to Congress. In his 1976 memoir, The Right and the Power, The Prosecution of Watergate, Mr. Jaworski, who died in 1982, portrayed the roadmap as his master plan. He called it an unprecedented but legally proper solution to a difficult problem, harnessing a grand jury's power to issue a report as a way to get around his apparent lack of power to send information to Congress directly. A federal judge overseeing the grand jury and a federal appeals court approved the move. In a declaration accompanying the petition filed on Friday, Mr. Bates said that when he was working for Mr. Starr more than 2 decades later, he asked the National Archives for a copy of the roadmap report to study as a model, but was told that it was still secret. He said he had recently tried to obtain it under a Freedom of Information Act request, but was rebuffed for the same reason. The Starr report, which Mr. Bates wrote with Brett M. Kavanaugh, whom Mr. Trump has nominated to the Supreme Court, in case you didn't know, contained extensive legal analysis and explicitly concluded that Mr. Clinton should be impeached, along with lurid detail about Mr. Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky. The Watergate roadmap is said to have been far more terse and understated. The final product contained the information we sought to transmit, with references to particular tapes and testimony of particular witnesses, and that's all, Mr. Jaworski wrote. There were no comments, no interpretations, and not a word or phrase of accusatory nature. The roadmap was simply that, a series of guideposts if the House Judiciary Committee wished to follow them. In another declaration, Mr. Goldsmith noted the incongruity that the Watergate-era document has a better historical reputation than the Starr report, and yet is unavailable for public scrutiny. He argued that making it public would help inform discussion of any effort by Mr. Mueller to send information to Congress, a task that could require navigating difficult and sensitive issues of executive power, separation of powers, and individual rights. The petition was also accompanied by 3 declarations from Watergate-era figures who argued that it was time to make the roadmap public. 2 Watergate prosecutors, Richard Benveniste and Philip A. Lacovara, and John Dean, the White House counsel for Mr. Nixon. So, a very interesting question. Should the thing be made public? Should it be a roadmap for drawing a new roadmap, etc., etc.? And the very interesting question of whether or not it is proper and authorized for a grand jury to send its information. I guess it would have to ask the judge presiding over them for his aid, I guess, in transmitting this report to Congress, and whether or not that is a proper thing to do. Now, there's some history with that, and that means I have to stand up from the chair and go to the archives. I'm walking to the library, the KITM in-house library, a bookcase not far from the microphone, but far enough that you can hear the difference in sound quality as I make my way over there. But I was reminded, as I come back to the table here, that I've heard this before. This was not news for me, and it didn't come from any inside knowledge of the roadmap or anything like that. It came from the days when I was insisting, and I think altogether properly, that George W. Bush, by right, ought to have been impeached, though he was not. And we never had the votes to make it happen anyway, but it would have been altogether right and proper. But it sparked a memory for me. And those of you who have been following these issues and engaged politically online, and particularly have been longtime Daily Kos readers, may remember the story of Jefferson's Manual, Section 603, which, let's see, I can't remember exactly who it was that even brought this to my attention, but in my looking at it, Jefferson's Manual is a sort of, how shall we say it? It's not the rule book, but it incorporates the rule book. And, I don't know exactly how to put it. I mean, the House rules are in here, but also references to all of the House precedents. But Jefferson's Manual, in particular, was in fact a document compiled by Thomas Jefferson, as the name implies, but basically a survey of general parliamentary law, both English and early American, that was supposed to serve as a sort of generalized parliamentary law and rule book for the Congress, and generally speaking has more relevance in the House of Representatives than it does in the Senate. But again, it's not the rule book, and it has evolved into a sort of overall compendium of Jefferson's Manual. It's printed in a book that compiles both Jefferson's Manual and the rules of the House as currently constituted. And the bulk of it really is in historical and precedential notes on each of the current House rules and Jefferson's Manual itself. Every time he refers to a certain topic, we're referred to the current analog in House rules and other various historical precedent along the way. So here's the deal. Section 603 is comprised entirely of notes on the manual. Jefferson's Manual, the part that Jefferson wrote with regard to impeachment, and this is what I was researching at the time, so Section 603 is a follow-up on 602, which is actual text from Jefferson's Manual on parliamentary law as to accusations in impeachment. Accusation, he writes, the Commons, as the grand inquest of the nation, becomes suitors for penal justice. Don't laugh, Penal. The general course is to pass a resolution containing a criminal charge against the supposed delinquent, and then to direct some member to impeach him by oral accusation at the bar of the House of Lords. This is English law he's describing, in the name of the Commons. The person signifies that the articles will be exhibited and desires that the delinquent may be sequestered from his seat or be committed, or that the peers will take order for his appearance. Essentially, in trying to figure out what impeachment would mean under the American Constitution or whatever American organizing principles we eventually adopted, Jefferson was offering the roadmap, so to speak, of how England, in its law, handled impeachment. The lower house would make a declaration of impeachment to the upper house and display the evidence against the delinquent and leave it to the upper house to decide what to do with the person once the lower house had decided for itself that it would make such a presentation. And lo and behold, we found ourselves designing a similar system here in the United States. We spoke English. We were previously English subjects. Guess what? We thought, I don't know, for whatever reason, we placed a very high value on the English system of law. It was the only one we knew, and we continued with it, but in our own context and eventually under the Constitution. So, Section 603 follows on that. Inception of impeachment proceedings in the House. How does the House get around to deciding that it wants to make a presentation to the upper house impeaching the delinquent? Well, it goes on to say in Section 603, in the House there are various methods of setting impeachment in motion. By charges made on the floor on the responsibility of a member or delegate, by charges preferred by a memorial, which is usually referred to a committee for examination, by resolution dropped in the hopper by a member and referred to a committee, by a message from the president, believe it or not, but remember the president isn't the only one subject to impeachment, but the president can say, hey, I think this other official ought to be impeached for whatever reason, as opposed to firing them. Or if it's a lifetime appointed judge, for instance, you could say, you can send that to Congress. What else is possible for the inception of impeachment? That could happen by charges transmitted from the legislature of a state. That's what we were focusing on way back when it was George W. Bush, and legislatures of states were being encouraged to send such resolutions to Congress in the hopes of triggering some impeachment hearings. And also, including right after that, by charges transmitted from the legislature of a state or a territory, by the way, or from a grand jury. There's more, of course, from facts developed and reported by an investigating committee in the House. That's the traditional way we do things these days. And even really by recognition, similar to the way the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit was said to be able to initiate an investigation, really by common reporting and common knowledge, if it's taken note of in the House. But essentially, this all comes down to a member of the House has to make some mention of it on the floor, either directly proposing that there be an impeachment in a speech on the floor, or submitting a resolution of impeachment in the hopper, or whatever. But even if it comes from a state legislature, it wasn't the fact that the state legislature would have adopted the thing and sent it to Congress that triggers by itself impeachment hearings. But if a member takes note of it and submits it for the record and then makes a direct proposition to impeach with this as evidence that it was that he had real reason to speak up about such things, then that was considered a valid inception of impeachment proceedings, and that would make for a very highly privileged motion that would get at least an hour of debate in the House. At that point, the relevant committee could decline to take any action on it, but it had been mentioned. And of course, in this day and age, when you can see these things on C-SPAN, that means something. Back in the day, people disputed that this was possible, and they said, back in the George W. Bush days, well, it's not the case that a petition from a state legislature automatically impeaches the president. And that was never the argument. Now, people got confused about such things, and they said such things, and it was wrong, but what it doesn't mean is that this precedent doesn't exist. And so it's interesting for a number of reasons, not least of which is that also included in here is precedent for inception of impeachment proceedings on the report from a grand jury. Now, it's only going to be here in these notes if it had happened in the past, and it had, and there's reference to the case. And as a matter of fact, it's an early 1900s case, the impeachment of a judge, Charles Swayze of Florida, as it happens. This brings me to the point about Wikipedia and the point originally, I just remembered, about AMP. And AMP being a crappy publishing platform and how you can't tell the notes from the text. This is the interesting thing. I went back and took a look at this because this came up again. I looked up Jefferson's Manual, just trying to make sure I could find it online because people often want to have links to look at. And there's a Jefferson's Manual entry in Wikipedia. Not surprising. And there's a section in there on impeachment. And I read it, and it was interesting because I had studied this thing pretty closely for a long time, getting interested on this impeachment subject. And when I read what was originally in Wikipedia, I was moved for the first time to register and change a Wikipedia entry. It said, in recent years, Jefferson's Manual has mistakenly been cited to support the idea that state legislatures can initiate congressional impeachment proceedings. It is commonly repeated that Thomas Jefferson wrote in Section 603 of his Manual of Parliamentary Practice for the use of the Senate of the United States, it eventually only became applicable in the House, that in the House there are various methods of setting impeachment in motion, including by charges transmitted from the legislature of a state or territory, as we read. The source of this error, this goes on to say in Wikipedia, is a misreading of the House of Representatives House Rules and Manual as disseminated online. That House document does contain the complete text of Jefferson's Manual, but it also includes commentary and authorities for that commentary on subsequent congressional practice. The assertion that state legislatures can initiate impeachment proceedings is part of the House Rules and Manual, but it was never a part of Jefferson's own text. The House document, not Jefferson's Manual, labels this Section 603, Inception of Impeachment Proceedings in the House. The House document is available online in both text and PDF versions. The text version, this is why AMP is important, is the source of the misunderstanding, since Jefferson's words on impeachment and the congressional gloss are indistinguishable. In the PDF version, however, it is clear that Jefferson's Manual is printed in large font, while the subsequent commentary appears in smaller type. Jefferson's Manual, in its original form, with its final section 53 on impeachment, may also be viewed online. Very interesting point, as it turns out, written by a professor of, as I said, I think a professor of Jeffersonian democracy, which I didn't even know was an endowed seat anywhere, but I guess it is. Or not an endowed seat, but a post in I don't know where. But it was very interesting, and I guess that made him sound rather authoritative. And hey, essentially he was saying, I'm a Jefferson scholar. I know that this part, what's in Section 603, was not written by Jefferson. It's not part of Jefferson's Manual per se. Of course, it appears in Section 603 of what is published as Jefferson's Manual. And yes, it's a rules compendium, but it does make the important point that yes, there is a difference between the material that appears in large type, if you can see it, and the material that appears in small type. However, this Jeffersonian democracy professor makes an important mistake. It's very interesting to separate the authorship and good for historical understandings of things. But what it doesn't do is argue in any way that the information in Section 603 is invalid. Jefferson's not the author, but Section 603 is a perfectly valid compilation of existing precedents. What was really amazing was that when I read in the Wikipedia talk section about this, that this professor and some of his questioners in the talk section had no idea at all what the even smaller type inside the small type meant when it referred you to the different House precedents. It tells you in Section 603 that a grand jury reference is in fact a valid method of inception of impeachment proceedings, but he had no idea what the note afterward meant. It reads, in parentheses, Roman numeral 3, comma, 2488. close parentheses. And he had no idea that that Roman numeral 3 stood for the compilation of Heinz Precedents, Volume 3, and the number 2488, Section 2488. Now, if they had understood that, amazing that a professor would not understand that, they would have been able to read Heinz Precedents online. I gave them the link to do so, and it will clearly tell you the story of Charles Swayze and how his impeachment proceedings came to be. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a different one. But it will tell you the story of how, actually it was Charles Swayze who was impeached on resolution of the Florida state legislature. The grand jury story is a different one, and with a different precedent cited. But what was amazing was that they could not figure out that despite the fact that they were able to establish that the authorship was different, this is a valid precedent. It's historical. It happened. A professor of history with no ability to determine where to find an original source on what had actually happened in history. I thought amazing.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, okay, as usual, I ate up all the time that I usually like to give over to what's coming up next on Justice's program, but I wanted to just fit that part in there. I corrected the record on Wikipedia, although it still stands on the wikivisually.com page, just for the record. Anyway, I found that rather amazing. Yes, a grand jury has done it, and it can do it again. We'll talk more about it later.